In just 6 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a resilient black attorney, caused an earthquake in the federal courtroom, exposing a Supreme Court justice's true nature right in front of 3 live television cameras. The question is, how did she turn the trial into a nightmare for the person sitting in the seat of justice? At 8:00 a.m., the federal courthouse in the Western District was thick with the scent of pressure, as if even the bricks knew what was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett, dressed sharply in a charcoal gray suit, strode confidently down the long hallway, the cold granite floors echoing beneath her feet. In her hand was a thick stack of files labeled in bold red "State versus Lawson Misappropriation of Public Funds." She was no stranger to pressure, but today felt different. Not because of the case's gravity. She'd faced armed criminals and indicted police officers before, but because of the name sitting in the judge's seat, Sonia Sotomayor. As Jasmine pushed open the heavy wooden door to the courtroom, her eyes didn't first meet the jury or the public waiting in anticipation, but the cold, calculating gaze of the judge. It was slow, deliberate, as if Sotomayor were sizing her up like a worthless item on a clearance shelf. No nod, no formalities, just an arched eyebrow, a glance at her watch, and a look that screamed, "Why are you here? Do you even deserve to be in this room?" Jasmine felt something tighten in her throat. Not fear, but a realization. She wasn't walking into a courtroom today. She was stepping into a fortress of power, one built long before her arrival. On the defendant's side, Charles Lawson, the wealthy real estate developer, spoke softly with his attorney, absently toying with his expensive watch. They didn't look worried. Lawson even flashed a casual smile at a man in a suit near the prosecution bench, as if they were about to watch a cheap play. As Jasmine placed her files on the table, her eyes caught 3 reporters in the last row nodding politely. A camera was being adjusted. The court was open to the public today, and every move she made would be scrutinized like a dissection. But what truly gnawed at her wasn't the cameras, it was the elderly woman in the public gallery. Her simple appearance in a worn coat. A security guard had just told her she was in the wrong seat. The woman stood bending slightly to apologize, her eyes filled with humiliation. Jasmine saw it, and saw that the white man next to her spilling out of his row wasn't corrected. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was a silent message from the building: who has power and who doesn't. The heavy door slammed shut behind her. No turning back. Jasmine took a deep breath, adjusted her collar, and stared straight ahead, where power sat high, cloaked in black robes, but with eyes full of bias. Her anger hadn't erupted yet, but it smoldered quietly beneath the surface like fire under ash. Today's battle wouldn't just be about justice for the state. It was a confrontation between truth and the decayed power that had survived too long on the silence of those who once stood where she stood. The stenographer's keys tapped away, punctuating the heavy silence like an unsettling drumbeat signaling the rising tension about to consume the courthouse. Jasmine had barely stepped into the room when every eye turned to her, not with curiosity, but with cold, calculated scrutiny, as if they already knew everything about her and were waiting for her to falter, to fail. The defense attorney, an aging man with the polished air of someone fresh from a high-end cocktail party, tilted his head and exchanged a knowing glance with the judge. The room felt like a performance, a play where Jasmine hadn't been given the script. Justice Sotomayor tapped lightly on the file before her fingers drumming with deliberate slowness, almost savoring the moment. Then, without a flicker of empathy, she looked up and sneered. "I hope Miss Crockett isn't here to turn this into a circus." Her words cut through the still air like a blade. No mention of the case, no recognition of Jasmine's role as a state-appointed prosecutor, just a dismissive sentence that hit harder than a slap. It wasn't just an insult to her. It was an insult to everyone who'd ever worked in the legal system, to the very foundation of law and order. Jasmine didn't flinch, but inside something cold and sharp sliced through her chest, a realization that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't a courtroom. She wasn't facing a judge. She was standing before a woman who'd already chosen her side, a side that didn't care about justice or truth, a side built on power, on the arrogance of those who'd always been above the law, who'd never had to answer for their actions. A soft, mocking laugh came from the back, followed by others quiet but laced with venom, loud enough to be heard, soft enough to escape reprimand. Jasmine felt their eyes, every sneer, every dismissive glance. It wasn't just the judge. It was the whole room, clerk, security officers, everyone complicit in this silent, calculated game. She sensed it in the air, the satisfaction, the expectation. They were waiting for her to stumble, to be torn apart, for daring to enter a place never meant for someone like her. She scanned the room, searching for a flicker of support, a sign of neutrality. But all she saw were faces locked in stone, frozen in cold indifference, each playing their part in a theater rehearsed too many times to change the script. Her grip tightened on the file's fingernails, pressing into her palm. The pressure was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the feeling rising inside her. She'd been here before, the isolation, the sense of not belonging in a room full of power. She'd felt it as a public defender fighting police every step on a razor's edge. But today was different. She wasn't just facing an unjust system. She was up against a system already rigged, already set. The judge wasn't impartial. The defense didn't care about truth. They'd chosen their winners and losers, and Jasmine knew deep in her bones that if she didn't play every move perfectly, if she faltered even slightly, she'd be crushed. Not because she was wrong, but because she dared to step into their world. She wasn't supposed to be here in this fight, in this space where power had always belonged to others. They'd made it clear from the start they'd stop at nothing to make her fail. Every glance from the gallery, every judgment from the judge, every word from the defense attorney was designed to make her feel small, to make her question her place. The weight of their expectation was heavy, suffocating. Jasmine felt it all around her. She wasn't just fighting for justice in this case. She was fighting for her own place in a system built to shut her out. If she didn't succeed today, it wouldn't just be a loss for the case, it would be a loss for everything she'd ever fought for. Everything she'd ever believed in. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a battleground where the truth would either rebunt or be buried forever beneath power, prejudice, and injustice. If Jasmine wasn't careful, if she didn't take every step with precision, every word with purpose, their crushing expectations would drag her down and she'd never rise again. The silence deepened, thick and suffocating, the calm before the storm. Jasmine stood at the edge of a precipice. The only way out was forward, no turning back. The courtroom might be rigged, the odds stacked against her, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going down without a fight, and she'd make sure no one would ever forget what happened here today. Jasmine opened the file before her, pulling out a document stamped by the State Treasury Department, and stepped to the podium with calm, unyielding poise. She knew the evidence in her hands. Budget sheets, wire transfer records, investment fund reconciliations wasn't just numbers. These were concrete traces of corruption, millions of taxpayer dollars illegally funneled into a shell company owned by Charles Lawson. But before she could speak, before she could get through the introductory line, a voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the air from the bench, merciless. Figures. Oh, not this again. Sotomayor didn't glance at the documents. She leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced, eyes wandering as if forced to endure a tedious lecture from a failing student. I don't have time for boring numbers, she emphasized, then turned left, exchanging a knowing look with the defense attorney. A soft laugh rippled through the back row, louder, more brazen, as if Jasmine were telling a joke in class rather than presenting evidence of multi-million-dollar fraud. A court officer snorted quietly. The stenographer stopped typing, lifting her gaze with indifferent, dismissive eyes. Lawson's attorney smirked, tapping his pen lightly against the desk, keeping time to a song he'd heard too many times and never took seriously. Jasmine remained composed, but her chest burned. The offense wasn't just the words, it was how the entire room responded, as if her truth meant nothing simply because proving it came from her. She glanced at the jury, hoping for a glimmer of understanding, but their faces lowered, avoiding her gaze as if she were an inconvenient distraction. No one wanted to get involved in a standoff between a Supreme Court justice and a black female prosecutor. They chose silence, and in that silence, Jasmine heard the loudest voice of injustice. You're not welcome here. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. Your Honor, this data was gathered and certified by 3 independent financial agencies. It reveals an unusual transfer pattern twice the approved amount into the defendant's own company. Sotomayor chuckled softly, never looking up. Very creative, Miss Crockett. Planning to write a financial novel, the viewers, even those watching through screens, could feel their blood rising. A woman bringing truth to court only to be mocked as if she had no right to be there. What ignited their anger wasn't just the judge's opposition. It was that the whole room, every person knew she was right, yet chose to sneer, to ignore, to suffocate her voice, all because she was Jasmine Crockett, a black woman daring to step where she wasn't wanted. Before Jasmine could step back from the podium, Sotomayor's voice sliced through again, sharper, reverberating across the courtroom. So you plan to mask your incompetence with a pile of boring documents. The words weren't a legal challenge. They were a personal attack, a strike meant to break her spirit. And the worst part, it came from the very person meant to uphold the law's neutrality, the Supreme Court justice, the so-called symbol of justice. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its breath, not in surprise, but because this was a familiar performance where power dictated who stood and who fell. The defense attorney, smug as ever, gave a slight nod, his lips curling into a barely concealed smirk. A court clerk near the door cleared his throat, unable to hide his amusement. A middle-aged man in a blue suit muttered loudly, "Who does she think she is? Probably just out of law school, doesn't even know how to read a report." The words echoed, yet no one challenged him, not even a glance from Sotomayor, who looked at him as if silently agreeing. The cruelty was acceptable legal because it was spoken under the guise of court proceedings. Jasmine stood motionless, her posture erect, but her hands clenched the files, now heavier than ever. She felt every gaze scrutinizing her, not to evaluate her evidence, but to see how much pressure she could take, how long before she crumbled under their relentless disdain. A woman in the back row whispered just loud enough, "Black female, and she thinks she can win here." The words hung in the air, a sharp reminder that her very presence was an affront. It wasn't just discrimination, it was the arrogant dismissal of someone daring to challenge a system never meant for her, a system built to serve the powerful and privileged. Then, as if the assault on her dignity wasn't enough, Sotomayor delivered another blow, her contempt undisguised. "Miss Crockett, I strongly advise you to tone down these emotional theatrics. This is a courtroom, not a stage for the over-dramatic performances of those who think they're victims." Her words were daggers aimed not just at Jasmine's case, but at her essence, her professional integrity. She wasn't questioning her strategy, she was dismissing her as a person with a casual sneer. And worse, no one stood up to defend her. Not a single soul flinched. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with injustice's stench. The audience, whether in person or behind screens, could no longer sit idly by. They felt her humiliation, her frustration, her anger on behalf of every person ever underestimated, belittled, or discarded. She wasn't wrong, she was doing what was right, standing for truth, for justice. But in a space where truth was an inconvenience, where a Supreme Court justice could crush someone with her power, there was no hope of fairness. Yet Jasmine didn't lower her gaze. She didn't retreat even in the face of their mockery, their cruelty, their overwhelming power. She stood tall, unwavering, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, but carried an unspoken fire that couldn't be extinguished. "Then I will let the next piece of evidence speak for itself." Her words cut through the room with clarity, deliberate, strong. She wouldn't bend. She wouldn't back down. Jasmine Crockett was not a woman who knelt before injustices seeking to break her. But as she faced the system's oppressive weight, a part of her knew the true question wasn't whether she'd break. It was who, in the end, would kneel. The courtroom thickened after Sotomayor's cold response. But Jasmine didn't let herself be dragged into the swelling tide of anger. She opened her second briefcase, pulling out a publicly available contract between the city and Charles Lawson's real estate company, then gently placed it on the projector. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, each word squeezing the air from the room, "this is the initial budget approval contract, $12, $5 million for the East Side residential redevelopment project." However, this budget statement obtained from the Federal Budget Office shows Lawson's company received $24.8 million. And what's even more significant is this. She turned the page. A new document appeared on the screen, a form allowing out-of-budget transfers signed and stamped with one signature. Sonia R. Sotomayor. The name flashed, clearly dominating half the screen in the stunned room. Every person, court clerk, defense attorney, security officers, held their breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The signature was glaringly clear. It couldn't be forged, fabricated, or denied. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She kept her gaze locked on the Supreme Court justice perched high on her bench where people still believed conscience and justice could coexist. But now both were distorted by a single stroke of ink. Sotomayor leaned forward slightly, clasped her hands, and glanced at the document with the disinterested air of someone perusing a restaurant menu. Then she muttered, "Cold as ice, invalid." Jasmine furrowed her brows, hesitating for a beat. "Your Honor, this document was collected under subpoena from the State Department of Justice, authenticated and stored in the federal system." But Sotomayor was unwavering. "I said it's invalid, and it's invalid," she retorted. For the first time in the trial, her eyes met Jasmine's directly. Not as a judge assessing an argument, but as a woman wielding absolute power to dismiss her opponent. A whisper rose from the back row. "Oh my God, she really did sign it!" A middle-aged woman covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. But Sotomayor didn't care. She tapped her gavel lightly against the desk. "Document discarded. Move on." Jasmine's heart pounded not from fear, but from the blatant audacity being legitimized in broad daylight. She'd just presented clear evidence that an active Supreme Court justice had approved illegal budget transfers, and the system dismissed it as a typographical error. Justice wasn't just overlooked, it was trampled, distorted all through the very pen meant to protect the truth. And they called this procedural justice. The audience, no longer merely angry, felt something deeper: fear. If a Supreme Court justice could so nonchalantly discard evidence implicating herself, what was left for the vulnerable, for those with no power to fight back? Jasmine didn't back down. Calmly, she moved to the original document, this time with an attached seizure order signed by the State Inspector General's office, the red ink stamp still fresh. "And here is the original copy from the Federal Archives, sealed by all three independent agencies," she said, her voice unwavering, as if no one had just tried to extinguish it with a mere dismissal. She projected the document onto the screen again, ensuring everyone, including the cameras, could see clearly Sonia Sotomayor's signature approving the out-of-budget transfer done just 6 days before Lawson purchased the redevelopment land at a price almost too good to be true. Sotomayor stared at the screen for a few seconds, then turned away as if her own name sickened her. She raised an eyebrow and looked at Jasmine with a gaze as cold and sharp as steel. "This is a forged document," her voice rang out, decisive, unflinching, but with no evidence, no explanation, no justification, just a statement from the one in power. The room felt nailed shut. No one reacted. No one asked for clarification. Jasmine stood still, not confused but understanding. She was no longer in a fair trial. There were no rules, no procedural principles protecting the truth. This was a stage, and the director wore the robes of a Supreme Court justice, both the criminal and the mastermind behind justice's erasure. A court officer approached the prosecution table, pretending to adjust the microphone, but whispered something to the clerk. They laughed. The cameraman shifted the lens away from the evidence, redirecting it toward Lawson, who sat calmly, his face suggesting he knew everything would be wiped clean. None were shocked. No one objected. They were accustomed to living in Sotomayor's shadow. For Jasmine, the truth no longer felt like a sharp knife. It was the excuse they used to suffocate her in broad daylight. Her fist clenched tightly, nails digging into her palm hard enough to sting. But she didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't plead. She looked directly at the woman on the high bench with a cold, unyielding gaze, not at a Supreme Court justice, but at a criminal hiding behind power's veil. In that moment, the audience held their breath. They began to understand the woman sitting in judgment had signed off on the crime, and she'd just casually wiped it away in front of dozens in a country calling itself a symbol of justice. The courtroom simmered thick with tension after Sotomayor's blatant dismissal. She remained seated in her high chair, hands folded, the image of someone who believed she'd already won. Lawson reclined, one leg casually draped over the other as if waiting for his morning coffee. The room was eerily quiet, no one daring to challenge the power in the room. Jasmine knew with stark clarity the truth wasn't just being suffocated. It was being buried alive by a system so corrupt it had rotted from within. But she wouldn't let it end here. She stood in the storm's center, her gaze locked with Sotomayor's cold, sneering contempt. This time she made her move. A sharp crackle came from the speaker on the prosecution table. The static cleared and a familiar voice rang out, dripping with venom. "Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger, understood?" The air, already thick, turned suffocating. The crowd lost its breath. Every head turned, eyes wide in disbelief. Pens dropped. Recorders froze momentarily before clicking again. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood stone-faced, her voice steady, commanding, pressing down on every soul in the room. Did everyone just hear whose voice that was? No one answered. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. It was Sonia Sotomayor's voice, unmistakable, undeniable, irrefutable. No longer could this be dismissed as a signature or speculation. This was a living, breathing voice, commanding evidence, concealment, manipulating the process, obstructing justice itself, a voice from the woman sworn to uphold the law, yet tearing it apart from within. Sotomayor leaned forward, her face drained of color for a moment, then flushed bright red, her anger palpable. "This record is illegal. It cannot be presented in court." Her voice cracked, showing real unease, breaking the veneer of control she'd held so tightly. But this wasn't a legal objection. It was a desperate cry from someone exposed. Jasmine, undeterred, didn't let her regain control. She calmly raised a printed copy of the valid warrant, holding it high for all to see. "This is a legally obtained recording authorized by the state prosecutor's office and verified by the federal inspector 3 weeks ago. I have adhered to every legal protocol." A low murmur spread through the jury. One whispered, "I can't believe this." In the back row, a woman gripped her purse, leaning toward her friend, eyes wide. "It's her. It's really her." The audience's anger shifted, not just a response, but an explosion of realization. The truth was laid bare. This wasn't an isolated misconduct. It was a systemic failure, a deliberate erasure of justice. The weight of the moment crashed down on everyone complicit in burying the truth. The room wasn't just silent, it was tense, holding its breath. Jasmine stepped forward, her movements deliberate, taking another breath before pressing play again. The same voice blared, "I don't care how. Just make sure she never touches the ledger, got it?" The words echoed like a hammer, striking the last remnants of illusion. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about who'd stand up and face the truth no matter the cost. The facade cracked completely. Sotomayor's mask of authority shattered, revealing a woman who'd abused her power, betrayed her oath. Yet her system had worked tirelessly to protect her, to ensure no one questioned her, no one stood in her way. Jasmine didn't back down. Her gaze, cold and unwavering, locked onto Sotomayor as if she were passing judgment herself. No verdict was needed now. Her eyes were the sentence. The room understood this wasn't a battle between a prosecutor and a defendant. It wasn't even about a case. It was larger, a confrontation between an individual determined to speak truth and a corrupt, self-serving system that had forgotten what justice meant. The system protecting women like Sotomayor was trembling. It trembled because Jasmine, a single woman, stood unbroken in the face of its rot. It trembled because for the first time the truth had a voice, and that voice was hers. The shockwave from the recording hadn't settled when Jasmine, with quiet authority, pulled out a thick folder, its edges marked with the federal government's seal. She opened it carefully, revealing the audio's exact transcript, each line time-stamped, bearing an independent audio examiner's seal. She laid it on the prosecution table and, with deliberate calm, pushed it toward the judge's bench as if presenting the final blow before delivering a verdict. Sotomayor stared at the transcript like a stain she couldn't remove, a mark that would follow her forever. Her face turned ghostly pale, the confident pink of her lips fading, leaving only the grim shade of a woman caught in her own web of deceit. Her eyes darted to the court clerk, to Lawson's attorney, to the cameraman. But every gaze avoided hers, as if the transcript's truth were fire and looking risked being consumed. Sotomayor stood with an almost violent motion, hands slamming the table to steady herself. Her gavel hit the wood with a force that echoed louder than ever. "This trial is over," she bellowed, her voice booming but lacking its former authority. It wasn't a decree, it was a desperate scream, a futile attempt to regain control. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't retreat or bow to the storm of authority. She stood straight, tall, unyielding. Her voice, though not raised, rang clearly like a bell in the silence. "No, you do not end this when you do not have the right." Her words were simple, without theatrics, but struck like lightning. The power behind them rattled the room. Sotomayor paused, unmoving, her eyes widened as if Jasmine's words had physically pushed her back, a sudden pull against gravity. The gavel, the robe, the high bench, the power she'd wielded so easily, suddenly laughable, fragile, absurd. The woman who'd crushed others now stood defenseless, unable to stop the truth sweeping through the courtroom in a heartbeat. Jasmine had done what many before her feared. She stripped Sotomayor of her power, forced her into the open where no gavel, robe, or legal pretense could shield her. A single recording, a single mistake achieved what years of legal arguments couldn't. The courtroom fell silent, thick with the weight of what had unfolded. The recording, a whisper moments ago, now hung heavily, suffocating the space where justice was once presumed to exist. Jasmine, still standing, her gaze unflinching, held her ground. She wasn't just presenting evidence, she was declaring in no uncertain terms that the law had been violated, that justice had been distorted, and that a woman meant to embody the law had become its greatest abuser. Sotomayor stumbled back, her face a mask of disbelief. She clenched her jaw, knuckles white against the desk, as if clinging to anything to preserve the illusion of control, but it was slipping and she knew it. She scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone, to stop Jasmine's momentum. But no one stood up, not the attorneys, not the jury, not the court staff. Jasmine's voice broke the silence again, firm, unyielding. "This is not over. Not until the truth is recognized for what it is." Her words hung heavy, unassailable, as if they alone could bring the corrupt system crashing down. Sotomayor, her face flushed with fury, stood abruptly, trying to regain control, but her movements were slow, calculated, like a woman desperate to hold something she couldn't grasp. She glared at Jasmine, eyes narrowing in anger, but there was no power in her gaze, only fear, the fear of realizing she was no longer in control. "This is madness," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You've gone too far, Miss Crockett." But Jasmine, unshaken, took another step forward. The room's weight pressed in, but she didn't bend. "The truth has gone too far," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not the one who took it there. You did." The air shifted, not just the temperature, not just the tension, but the feeling of something breaking, something irreparable shattering before their eyes. Sotomayor, once the embodiment of power, was stripped bare, exposed for the world to see. In that moment, as she stood before those she'd lorded over, there was no dignity in her posture, no nobility in her role. All that remained was a woman, an ordinary woman caught in her own lies. The room inhaled collectively, and for the first time people understood this wasn't about a legal case anymore. It was larger, more profound, a fight for justice, not just for the state, but for everyone crushed by a system that had lost its way. With one voice, Jasmine exposed the cracks in the system's foundation. She'd done the impossible, made them see the truth. In that moment, Sotomayor's power, her years of unchecked authority, evaporated. She was no longer the Supreme Court justice, no longer in control. The truth, once unleashed, was a force stronger than any gavel, robe, or title. As Sotomayor stood powerless, exposed, Jasmine realized this wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone silenced, for those who'd fought for justice against a rigged system. The system was trembling. They could no longer pretend, no longer ignore what had been laid bare. And the one person with the courage to stand up, Jasmine Crockett, had done what no one dared. She made them face the truth, and in doing so, she set justice free. The deafening silence hung over the courtroom for several long seconds after Jasmine's words. as if the entire space held its breath, anticipating the storm about to break. Then the courtroom door swung open. Two federal officers in dark blue uniforms strode in, their heavy steps echoing across the marble floor. They said nothing at first, no need. Their presence alone tightened the room, the cameras hum, the audience's quiet breaths like a bowstring drawn taut. Jasmine didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She'd known this moment would come. One officer stepped forward, pulling a paper from his pocket. His voice rang out clear as thunder, breaking the stillness. Sonia Sotomayor, pursuant to the orders of the U.S. Attorney General's office and the federal investigation, you are being arrested for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and aiding in the embezzlement of public funds. The room seemed to explode in a gust of cold air. Every eye snapped to the high bench where moments ago arrogant judgments had echoed. Sotomayor stood motionless, eyes widened, mouth slightly parted, as if to refute, deny, or salvage whatever remained of her title as Supreme Court Justice. But no sound came. No arguments, no dignity, above all, no one believed in the power she once represented. The handcuffs gleamed under the overhead lights, cold light reflecting off bright steel. The sharp click echoed as they locked around Sotomayor's wrists, each sound reverberating like a sentence needing no gavel. The woman who'd forced hundreds to kneel before her, who'd turned justice into a tool to punish the vulnerable, now bowed her head, not in humility, but because she no longer had the strength to keep it raised. A queen in a black robe, the supreme symbol of law, was now just a criminal shackled before the press, the jury, and a nation watching. No one protested, no shouts, no intervention. All that remained were gazes from reporters, citizens, the court clerk, even those who'd scoffed when Jasmine entered. Now all eyes locked on the moment, witnessing a woman once untouchable dragged from the bench like any criminal. They understood this punishment didn't come from the system, but from the truth Sotomayor could no longer suffocate. Jasmine remained standing, her gaze cold, not from lack of emotion, but because she knew this wasn't victory. It was repayment, a small part of the debt of justice society had neglected for years. The audience's anger from the case's start had transformed into a retaliatory blow, powerful, clear, impossible to ignore. Sotomayor was escorted past Jasmine. Her posture hunched, no longer the imposing Supreme Court justice atop the high bench, but a small, pitiful figure bound by the handcuffs she'd once ordered others to wear. As she passed, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. No mockery, no arrogance, no armor of power remained in her gaze, only fear and a shame so foreign it was almost unrecognizable. A woman who'd spent years believing she was untouchable now realized everything had crashed down. But Jasmine didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't nod in triumph like in movies. She stood still, motionless, an unwitting witness who needed no oath to tell the truth. For her, this wasn't a moment to celebrate, not because she felt nothing, but because she knew this was the truth, a truth that should have come long ago. She thought back to those who'd stood before this bench. Poor clients harshly judged for lacking decent lawyers. Black mothers pleading for their sons' futures, workers falsely accused for daring to sue exploitative companies. All had lowered their heads under Sotomayor's cold hand. A Supreme Court justice with the privilege to decide who was worthy of being heard and who was trash to be discarded. Now the woman who'd controlled hundreds of fates was controlled by her own hands. The courtroom was silent, the usual click-clack of cameras gone. Reporters, court staff, judicial officers stood frozen, witnessing something unseen before a Supreme Court justice. Arrested in the very courtroom where she'd sat in the highest seat. As the officers led Sotomayor out through the large door, no one looked away, not from curiosity, but because they were witnessing something rare. True justice wasn't the black robe, but the people who dared lift it, revealing the blood and rot beneath. Jasmine lowered her gaze for a moment, not to hide, but to swallow the memories of humiliation, scornful words, rejected files. She knew this was only the beginning. The anger within her hadn't vanished, it had taken a clearer shape, punishment. But the system remained, and she couldn't stop, not when so many like Sotomayor still used the law as a shield for their stained hands. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Sonia Sotomayor, sealing off the woman who'd once stood as judicial power's symbol. The air grew thick, suffocating not from her absence but because the shadow of authority looming over all was gone. Yet within that silence another presence shifted uneasily. Charles Lawson, lounging comfortably until now, stirred. His fingers tapped nervously on the table, an unconscious gesture revealing more than words could. His forehead beaded with sweat, palms clammy despite the courtroom's cool air. Jasmine wasted no time. She saw the shift, the man once untouchable now fidgeting under his guilt's weight. She turned her eyes to him, cold, unrelenting like a predator locked on prey. Her step was measured, deliberate, each echoing like a drumbeat signaling the final act. "Mr. Lawson," she spoke, her voice steady, each word cutting through the silence with icy precision. "You just saw what happened to a woman who thought she was untouchable." Her eyes locked with his, piercing, unmoving. Lawson didn't respond. His gaze darted around, seeking support, an ally to intervene. But Sotomayor was in handcuffs, and Lawson's legal team, once confident, was reduced to nervous glances and trembling grunts. Those who'd stood beside him were now powerless bystanders. Jasmine moved closer, her hand resting on the thick stack of documents on the prosecution table. She felt their weight, every word, every document gathered to expose the corruption plaguing the system. She turned a page, a deliberate motion, and slid it toward Lawson. "Your signature is right here," she said, her voice low but full of authority alongside Sotomayor's. "Do you really think your name won't be on an arrest warrant before long?" Lawson swallowed hard, the sound audible in the silence. His throat was dry, pulse quickening. Moments ago he'd been the powerful real estate mogul who thought he could buy his way out of anything, an untouchable king. But now, with one motion, his empire crumbled. Sotomayor had fallen, and Lawson knew when one part of a corrupt system collapses, the rest often follows. Jasmine stood tall, her gaze fixed on him. Her voice softened but carried a weight that made the room shudder. "Do you want to keep your life?" she asked, her words simple yet laced with quiet fury. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge built over years. Lawson flinched, his face reeling with anger and fear. For the first time he seemed small, insignificant. The facade of confidence that made him untouchable was gone, replaced by a man desperate to hold any semblance of control. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking around for an escape that wasn't there. Jasmine didn't wait for a response. She leaned in, her voice dropping lower, clear enough for all to hear. "Start talking, or you'll be the next one dragged out of this courtroom with shiny handcuffs on your wrists." Her words hung in the air, freezing the room as if time itself halted. The audience in the courtroom or behind screens felt the moment's power. The truth's weight was undeniable. Jasmine wasn't just speaking to Lawson. She was addressing every person complicit in the corruption tainting the system. Every person who turned a blind eye to the crushed. This wasn't about exposing one man's guilt, it was about bringing down a system built on lies, manipulation, and power abuse. It showed justice wasn't just winning a case, it was bringing truth to light no matter the cost. Lawson understood. Jasmine wasn't here to win a case, she was here to expose the corruption's foundation that let men like him and women like Sotomayor operate unchecked. She was here to tear down the walls protecting the guilty for too long. As the tension peaked, one thing was clear, this wasn't just one woman's downfall. It was a fight for justice itself, a fight long overdue, one Jasmine was determined to win. With every word, every step, she ensured the truth would never be buried again. Not by power, not by fear, not by those who thought they could control it all. Lawson sat, lips pressed tight, hands clasped, but trembling slightly. His face, once that of a man approving billion-dollar projects, hailed as the new urban architect, was pale, drained of color. He didn't speak immediately, but Jasmine remained unwavering, eyes fixed on him. She knew men like Lawson never fearing justice but fearing the light, losing control before the public, having their carefully crafted mask ripped away. Finally, Lawson exhaled, sharply tugging at his tie as if the air was too thick to breathe. I need protection," he stammered, his voice stripped of its former arrogance, surrendered not to justice but to harsh reality. His greatest shield, Sonia Sotomayor, had shattered before millions' eyes. Jasmine didn't respond beyond a subtle nod, but inside, something shifted, not satisfaction, not relief, but a surge of tension. She knew the game had just begun. What Lawson would reveal could unravel a labyrinth of power, a network tying politics, business, and the judiciary, those treating America as their playground, the law as their tool. She stepped closer, pulling out a prepared deposition form. She didn't ask why he spoke now. She didn't need his conscience's confession. She knew better. The real puppet masters were never innocent. What flared her anger wasn't Lawson's bloodied hands, but his manipulation of a system crushing countless innocent people wrongly accused. Left in poverty, stripped of homes and rights while he was celebrated as a reformer. She placed the pen on the table, her gaze unwavering. "I need the list, everyone involved." Lawson nodded, swallowing hard, fear unmistakable in his eyes. But all Jasmine saw was one thing: how many others were still lurking, sitting in leather chairs in high-rise offices, donating to campaigns, signing orders the poor could never challenge. She couldn't stop, not for revenge, but because the anger in her and millions crushed by this system would never cool while the truth stayed buried. Lawson, no matter how many names he gave, was just a small link in a chain too long uncalled by its true name: legalized crime. 1 week after the historic trial, the chambers of the United States Congress were no longer a place for empty promises or dull speeches. That day, the nation held its breath as Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a solemn black suit, walked to the podium amidst hundreds of lawmakers, reporters, and citizens who'd traveled hours to be there. Behind her stood the American flag, fluttering proudly, but this time not a symbol of pride, a painful reminder that justice is sometimes betrayed within the institutions meant to protect it. Jasmine placed the thick file on the podium. She didn't need papers, didn't need a prepared speech. What she'd say wasn't a speech, it was an indictment of conscience. "I stand here today," she began, her voice clear, unwavering, not to recount the trial that's past, but to remind everyone we cannot call this a nation of justice if the one wearing the robe of a Supreme Court justice is the very one who betrays the truth. The hall was stunned, many holding their breath. An elderly woman, perhaps a mother who'd seen her child wrongfully imprisoned, had tears streaming down her face. A black veteran stood, fist clenched, as if holding back a heart broken long ago. Jasmine locked eyes with them, with the country through millions of screens broadcasting live. When someone like Sonia Sotomayor can sit on the bench for nearly 2 decades, quietly selling justice to the rich, the fault lies not only with her. It lies with all of us, the ones who let silence become complicity. From the gallery, one person stood, then 2, then dozens. They didn't shout, didn't chant, just stood quietly, a declaration. "We understand, and we will not stay silent anymore." Applause erupted, not loud like a campaign rally, but subdued, heavy with tears. It wasn't adoration, it was acknowledgement of pain. Rage buried too long, finally named and led to action. Jasmine lowered her voice, delivering her final words not as a prosecutor, not as a congresswoman, but as a human being. No one is untouchable. No seat is high enough to remain untouched. If we truly want a just country, it is we, the people, who must rebuild justice through truth and through the anger we've been taught to suppress. In that moment, a society began to change, not through guns, not through blood, but through a voice daring to call out injustice at power's heart. In a small apartment on Chicago's South Side, an old television in the corner broadcast the live news from Congress. The screen's light reflected on the dark face of an 8-year-old girl, her eyes wide, unblinking, afraid to miss a moment. She didn't fully grasp Jasmine Crockett's big words from the podium, but she understood that gaze, the gaze of a woman who'd endured enough, stood up and changed something untouchable. Beside her sat her mother, a night shift nurse, fresh from a 14-hour workday, slumped against the sofa, eyes tired. But when Jasmine's final words echoed, "We cannot let this anger die in silence. Let it become the reason no one else has to fall like this again." The mother lifted her head. The little girl turned to her, her voice soft but powerful. A promise whispered into history, "Mom, I want to be like her." That statement didn't reach grand halls or politicians' ears. but it carried more weight than any applause. It marked something crucial. A well-timed outrage might not change the past, but it will shape the future. Jasmine couldn't see that girl, but she'd sparked a fire not just in the courtroom, but in millions of minds quietly waiting to be awakened. From single mothers in Baltimore to law students at UCLA, from war veterans to homeless in New York, everyone saw something they'd long feared to believe: the system could be overturned if someone dared expose it in the light. That light wasn't born from eloquent words, elections, or power, but from a trial where justice was violated, then reclaimed through anger that never cooled. Anger, if suppressed, becomes resentment. But if guided, it becomes the reason the next generation never bows their heads. From one whispered promise in that small room, thousands of children, black, brown, white, began to see the world with new eyes, not because justice was perfected, but because they knew if someone like Jasmine Crockett could do this tomorrow, they could too. If this made you feel something, anger, hope, the urge to stand for what's right, you already understand why stories like these must be told. Justice isn't just a system. It's a fight carried by voices like Jasmine's and people like you who choose to listen. Don't let this be the end. The next story might be the one that changes everything. Hit that subscribe button. Let's walk this journey together.